Chapter 81. The Final Frontier. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 81. The Final Frontier Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Watching the students laugh, Shui Bailong did not laugh. His face was expressionless. He was not telling jokes, but the truth. Although these students were already the best among the common people, they were still flowers that were sheltered in a greenhouse. Soon, the other students also saw Shui Bailong's expression. Their smiles gradually froze. They gradually realized the seriousness of the situation. Do you think this is a joke? I'm telling the truth. This is the only consequence of encountering a powerful monster. Shui Bailong said slowly. Hunting monsters is far more dangerous than you think. Even if humans rely on their technological advantages, it doesn't mean that humans can completely gain the upper hand. I once saw a regiment of soldiers being swallowed by a swarm of monsters. I'm not saying this here to superiority. I just want you to be careful. Don't treat actual combat as child's play. You are all elites selected from the common people. It's not easy for each of you to grow up until now. Don't lose your lives because of your carelessness. After looking at the crowd a few more times, he decided to stop scaring the students. He then continued, however, you don't have to worry too much. The battlefront is mainly sealed off by our army, so you shouldn't encounter any overly powerful monsters. In short, just do your best. They've high hopes for all of you. When it comes time for the college entrance exam in the future, taking the university entrance exam isn't the only way out. Our Federation Army is also thirsty for talent. There are countless important figures in our army. I believe that all of you should have heard of them. There's no need for me to introduce them. In fact, the outstanding ones among them aren't any less inferior to those who graduated from the top 10 universities. In the face of Shui Bailong's blatant attempt to poach them, neither Jin Feng nor Qin Wu had any reaction. Even though they had retired from the army, they did not feel that there was anything wrong with Shui Bailong's words. The school would not care about such matters because the school was only responsible for nurturing talents. In the end, the students could choose to enter a university or join the army. That was a personal choice. How could it be possible for the army to help accept students for actual combat without opening a backdoor for the army to recruit talents and give out some benefits? Actually, there were still many students who were tempted. Even in the focus classes, only a portion of them was able to enter the focus universities, not to mention the top 10 universities of the Federation. That was even rarer. Even Zhang Teng, or even someone as outstanding as Yang, might not have a chance. Besides getting into a university, entering the army was indeed a way to stand out. Sir, if we enter the army, will we be able to enter your troop? A student raised his hand and asked. Shui Bailong laughed lightly and said, how can someone run if they haven't even learned how to walk? If you want to enter my troops and become my subordinates, you have to become the elite of the army. Only the best of the best have a chance. All of you are temporarily unqualified. Many people were not disappointed when they heard this. Instead, they were very curious about what kind of troop Shui Bailong came from to be so awesome. However, Shui Bailong did not explain to them because, at this time, a large transport plane descended from the sky and landed on the field. This transport plane was entirely black and had a unique metallic luster. The body of the plane was streamlined and it was the most aerodynamic shape. Since the anti-gravity formula had been deduced more than 100 years ago, anti-gravity flight was no longer rare. The plane did not need to run down long strips to take off and land. It could take off and land vertically. Even civilian flying cars use this anti-gravity flight technology. Alright, now that the transport plane has arrived, all of you should get on. It will take you directly to the battlefield at the edge of Calm Ocean City. Shui Bailong said. Currently, Donghua City is one of the largest base cities in the entire eastern region. Calm Ocean City was one of the satellite cities surrounding Donghua City, protecting Donghua City. Outside of Calm Ocean City was a desolate region ruled by endless monsters. The battle between the Federation Army and monsters around Calm Ocean City had never stopped. It was just that ordinary people could not feel it anymore. Usually, the Federal Army also did not allow ordinary people to get close to the battlefield. The students filed into this transport plane. Although there were many students in the two classes, over more than 100 people, this transport plane could hold all of them. Obviously, the military had mobilized this military transport plane to transport the students. After everyone had sat down, the transport plane rose vertically until it was high in the sky. Then, it turned on at full speed and flew out of Calm Ocean City. Sitting in the transport plane, one could not even feel the slightest bit of turbulence. Only the white clouds flying past the glass window alerted them that they were flying at high speed. Although they were still talking and laughing and had not looked nervous before, at this moment, many of them looked nervous now. It was a real battle that could kill people, and they had to go. They were like those born in the past. If they wanted to become human elites, they were no longer allowed to stay in their greenhouse. They had to be baptized by the bloody rain of monsters. The transport plane was very fast. After flying for only 10 minutes, it had already left the downtown area of Calm Ocean City. Gradually, the buildings seen from the plane started to peter out. After flying for a few more minutes, a huge barricade appeared in front of everyone. It was a huge city wall made of steel and cement. It was over 100 meters tall and was many miles long. They could only see an endless line that stretched to the horizon. Everyone was extremely shocked. However, the display of the humans was not on this city wall. Instead, it was more than 10 kilometers away from this city wall. This city wall was the last protection of Calm Ocean City. The transport plane flew out of the city wall. Everyone could see bunkers that were densely packed on the ground. From time to time, tongues of fire would shoot out and eliminate the monsters that pounced on them one by one. There were also all kinds of firearms displaying their might. The transport plane landed in the middle of a bunk at the center. Before everyone got off the transport plane, Shui Bailong distributed a wristband to everyone. He said, "You must take good care of this wristband. You must not lose it, because there's an electromagnetic wall on the front line. If you encounter a large number of monsters, or monsters that are too powerful, just retreat to the other side of the electromagnetic wall. Those monsters will be blocked, but the electromagnetic wall can only identify you by the wristband on your hand. If you lose the wristband, you won't be able to enter. Also, don't stray too far away from your position, or we won't be able to make it in time even if we want to. Alright, I won't say much else. I believe your homeroom teacher has already told you to get off the plane." Chapter 82. The first real combat. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 82. The first real combat. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Everyone took a wristband and put it on their wrists. Then, they lined up and got off the plane. From afar, they could see that this was an empty space. The two sides of the empty space were about 5 kilometers apart and each of them had a huge fortress. This was a war fortress built using the latest technology of mankind. All kinds of firearms were constantly firing. No matter how many monsters there were, they were unable to break through the defenses of the two fortresses. It could be said that they were indestructible. Of course, this was under the condition that there was no sudden monster swarm. If there was a monster swarm, then these fortresses would probably not be able to defend themselves and would collapse. Since ancient times, who knew how many monster swarms had occurred? Most of them were fended off by the human army. However, there were times when humans had been unsuccessful. However, the price of that was the fall of a city. Millions upon millions of people had become food for the monsters. Every time something like this happened, it would always cause a huge uproar. Do you see the area in the middle of the two fortresses? That area is reserved for you. It'll become your battlefield. After a period of time, the electromagnetic curtain wall will be activated between the two fortresses. If you are unable to hold out, retreat to behind the curtain wall. As long as you're wearing that wristband, you'll be able to pass through the electromagnetic curtain wall freely. Shui Bailong said. The students all nodded. That was their final guarantee. Chu Yunfan looked at the center of the two fortresses. He had heard that the electromagnetic curtain wall would not be activated because the attacks of ordinary monsters would not be able to break through the 360° all-around firepower net of the two fortresses. Only during a beast swarm would the electromagnetic curtain wall be activated. That was because the density of the monster's attacks could be said to be densely packed and would cover the sky and the earth. It was like the impact of a raging wave. Even if the firepower of such a fortress was fully activated, it would not be able to stop a swarm. At that time, it was necessary to activate the electromagnetic curtain wall to stop it. Everyone was quickly divided into their classes, with Qin Wu and Jin Feng taking the lead. After arranging some matters, Shui Bailong quickly left. He was already in a high position at such a young age, so he naturally did not have so much leisure time. To put it bluntly, number 13 high school was just an ordinary high school. Being able to invite Shui Bailong was already unexpected. After Shui Bailong left, only then did Qin Wu open his mouth and say, "In front of you is the battlefield. Mr. Jin Feng from Class 1 and I will hold the line for you not far away. If you feel that you can't hold out any longer, retreat to the electromagnetic curtain wall. We'll also patrol and try not to be too far away from the electromagnetic curtain wall. Moreover, if necessary, you can form small teams." After giving out some basic instructions, the crowd was officially dispersed. From afar, the crowd could even see some monsters charging toward the empty space in the middle where there was no crossfire. Kill the monsters. No one knew who shouted, but everyone raised their weapons and charged forward. More than 100 students were spread out over the open space of 10 kilometers. It was only a few hundred meters to the front line and they had arrived so quickly. They all had cultivation bases, and at the very least, they were all in the Qi nourishment stage. This little distance was nothing at all. With each jump, they could directly jump over 10 meters. Even the long jump world champions of the Common Era had to admit defeat. Chu Yunfan also charged through the electromagnetic curtain wall. Immediately, he felt a fierce aura fly toward him. Not far away from the electromagnetic curtain wall, dozens of monsters were pacing back and forth, looking at them from afar with fierce eyes. The monsters stared straight at them. It was as if they were looking at food. This did not make Chu Yunfan cower. Instead, it made the blood in his body boil. Those monsters treated them as prey, so how could they not treat these monsters as prey as well? In the crowd, Zhang Teng and Ouyang took the lead and charged forward. The two of them seemed to be competing with each other, and almost simultaneously found a monster. The students started fighting with those monsters around the same time as well. They had never fought with monsters before, and fighting with these monsters proved to be completely different from their usual internal sparring. These monsters had grown up fighting every day. They were extremely ferocious and every attack they made was vicious and deadly. After just exchanging blows, a few students got sliced and hurriedly retreated to heal their injuries. For a moment, the entire scene appeared to be in a mess. They're just a few rookies. From afar, two figures stood with their hands behind their backs, patrolling like hawks. It was Qin Wu and Jin Feng. The two of them were far behind the students. If the students were to encounter a dangerous situation, they would immediately take action. These students are being treated much better than we were back then. When we were soldiers, when would we have heard that there was an instructor behind us? That would have been impossible. Jin Feng said with a slight smile. After all, they're not soldiers. You can't expect them to be like soldiers. They are two different paths. Qin Wu looked at the student's flustered performance and a smile flashed across his face. He recalled when he was still young. Although he had received more than a year of training in the army at that time, he was still flustered when he stepped onto the battlefield for the first time. After the battle, he was berated by the old class monitor. But now, those years would not return. These students were all very inexperienced and obviously did not have much experience. But fortunately, their physical fitness was much better than an average person of the common era. Even if those people back then had met with such an impossible situation, they could still recover from it. So Qin Wu did not make a move. Although there were definitely some people who would be injured, it meant nothing to him. Even if they lost an arm or a leg, with current technology, they could regenerate limbs. It was not a problem at all. These students would be the main pillars of humanity in the future. If they could not bear such a small setback, then there was no need to waste resources on them. However, when his gaze fell on some of the elite students, he could not help but nod his head in satisfaction. Be it Zhang Teng or Ouyang, their performance was commendable. Even Tang Xiu, whom he paid special attention to, performed surprisingly. In terms of cultivation, she was weaker than Zhang Teng or Ouyang, but she was calm and collected. She did not panic even in the face of a ferocious monster. Your class's Tang Xiu is not bad. She has a big heart. Her future is limitless. Jin Feng commented. However, when his gaze turned to a certain spot on the battlefield, he could not help but stare dumbfounded. Qin Wu, who was beside him, also turned his gaze over. He also had a shocked expression. Chapter 83. The surprise of the two homeroom teachers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 83. The surprise of the two homeroom teachers. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. As far as their eyes could see, it was a scene of a human and a monster fighting. That person was Chu Yunfan, and in front of Chu Yunfan was a monster that was like a ferocious tiger. This monster was about 2 meters tall, one head taller than Chu Yunfan. Its body was more than 6 meters long, however, there were 2 fangs that jutted out from its mouth like sharp swords. Its entire body was covered in densely striped scales that protected its body. Armored saber-toothed tiger. The pupils of the two teachers shrunk slightly at first because this was a ferocious monster with an illustrious reputation. This monster came to be when a tiger of earth was transformed using spirit energy. An armored saber-toothed tiger that was only over 2 meters tall had yet to mature. An adult armored saber-toothed tiger could be more than 5 meters tall. They had even discovered a saber-toothed tiger king once that was more than 10 meters tall and dozens of meters long. They had caught a glimpse of it during a monster swarm that had annihilated an entire regiment of Federation soldiers. However, even a young armored saber-toothed tiger was not something that the students could deal with. This was because the armored saber-toothed tiger was not only extremely strong and agile but its entire body was covered with a type of scale that could not be damaged by swords. It could be said that among the many monsters that the students had encountered, none of them could compare to the armored saber-toothed tiger. Therefore, their first reaction was to rush over to rescue Chu Yunfan. However, they immediately reacted as well. This was because Chu Yunfan was actually holding up against the powerful monster. On the battlefield, the students were facing monsters that were smaller in number than them. After experiencing initial fluster and after a few people having been injured, they all began to cooperate in 2s and 3s. Only then did they barely manage to block the monsters in front of them. There were also some others who were performing well. For example, Ouyang, Zhang Teng, Tang Xiu, and some others were able to face the monsters in front of them head-on with their own strength. However, they were only able to contend with these monsters and were barely able to fend them off. It was very difficult for them to injure the monsters in front of them. However, Chu Yunfan was different. He did not unsheath his saber. Initially, Qin Wu and Jin Feng only felt that he was being too arrogant. However, upon closer inspection, although Chu Yunfan did not unsheath his saber, his every strike was steady. Then, he slashed at the armored saber-toothed tiger's body. Both of them were experts who had survived life-and-death battles. Naturally, they understood the profoundness behind this seemingly ordinary move. When performing a strike, one would slash at the vital parts of the monster. This was not considered strange. What was strange was that each of Chu Yunfan's strikes would slash at the same place, at the crook of the armored saber-toothed tiger's front paw. Every saber strike was the same. No matter what movement the armored saber-toothed tiger made or where it was located, Chu Yunfan's strikes would always hit the same spot. Both of the teachers understood that this required not only extreme control but also a pair of eyes with an extremely accurate vision to be able to capture every movement of the armored saber-toothed tiger and make the correct judgment. What a formidable kid! Your class actually produced such a dark horse. Jin Feng praised without hesitation. He and Qin Wu were competitors, but they were not mortal enemies. Moreover, he would not do such a thing as belittling the juniors. Moreover, Chu Yunfan's performance really made his eyes light up. It was definitely not just because the others were being beaten back by their own monsters. At most, it was just a fight. Only Chu Yunfan was able to beat the armored saber-toothed tiger back continuously, single-handedly and with just one blade. His performance is indeed not bad. Qin Wu's gaze landed firmly on Chu Yunfan. Just from this simple battle, he could see many things. His past experience in the army had given him a wealth of combat experience that many people could not have. His strength is extraordinary. He's talented, his speed is not bad, and his stamina is very good. He has slashed out so many times without even needing to catch his breath. These are all basic physical qualities. However, no matter how strong a human's body is, other than a small handful of people, it is very difficult to compete with those monsters. This kid's skills are profound. He can't have already reached the perfection stage, right? And this ability to grasp every opportunity, it simply doesn't look like he is a person who is in actual combat for the first time. Jin Feng kept exclaiming in surprise. At the very least, he should be at the impeccable stage. He is indeed very talented in cultivation, and he's very sensitive when it comes to grasping opportunities. Qin Wu nodded as he watched. He could see that Chu Yunfan's strength was very great, but it was not so great that he could crush the armored saber-toothed tiger with one hand. The strength of monsters was overwhelming, not to mention that the armored saber-toothed tiger was one of the best among them. He noticed that Chu Yunfan's every strike landed on the same place. Even if the armored saber-toothed tiger's body was covered in scales and it was difficult for a sword to hurt it, but to continuously be slashed at the same spot, after 100 slashes, even if it was just the scabbard, it was still very terrifying. The scales around the slashed area started to shatter. The most wonderful thing is the grasp of the fighter. He's a natural-born warrior. The earth-splitting saber technique looks like a path of strength, but in fact, it relies on being continuous. He's fully displaying the characteristics of the earth-splitting saber technique, which is all about being continuous. Every stroke is made when the armored saber-toothed tiger had exhausted its strength and had yet to gather up more strength. No matter how much strength the armored saber-toothed tiger has, if it was restrained and could not be used, what use would that be? Amazing! Jin Feng could not help but clap his hands and laugh as he said. This was the true mystery behind Chu Yunfan being able to send the armored saber-toothed tiger retreating in defeat with just one hand. Chu Yunfan's strength was already great, but the armored saber-toothed tiger was unable to display any of its strength. Every time it wanted to pounce, Chu Yunfan would slash it on the shoulder with the scabbard. It was completely unable to exert any strength. This was why the battle scene was completely one-sided. Chu Yunfan's performance was consistent. He was like a robot. He was not afraid when facing such a monster. Every strike landed on the same spot. This required an extremely strong mental fortitude. Previously, he had said that Tang Xiu had great talent. Now, it seemed that Chu Yunfan was also a person with great talent. He's a good seedling, it's a waste to go to university. He should be sent to the army. He should be able to rise to the top very quickly. Qin Wu shook his head and said, "It's useless. I've already mentioned it to him. He's not interested. He still wants to go to university. He probably wants to get into one of the top 10 universities. It's not that easy. For an ordinary school like ours to produce even one student who can get into one of the top 10 universities per year is already a blessing. After he fails, we can recruit him. It will not be too late to snatch up a bag of gold." Jin Feng shook his head. Although he had high hopes for Chu Yunfan, he did not think that he could get into one of the top 10 universities. Those who could get into one of the top 10 universities would definitely be the elites of society, the pillars of humanity, and the best of the best. One suddenly, at this moment, Chu Yunfan no longer slashed out with his scabbard. Instead, he swept out with his saber, and the shine of the saber was blinding. Chapter 84. Breakthrough in the Roaring Wind Saber Technique, the Armored Saber-Toothed Tiger Dies. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 84. Breakthrough in the Roaring Wind Saber Technique, the Armored Saber-Toothed Tiger Dies. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The shadowless blade struck out, and a blinding white light flashed. Chu Yunfan unsheathed his saber, and it was exactly the same as before. He accurately slashed at the shoulder of the armored saber-toothed tiger's front paw. Pierce. A stream of fresh blood instantly sprayed out. Chu Yunfan's blade almost cut off the armored saber-toothed tiger's left front paw. The armored saber-toothed tiger's entire body was covered in hard scales. If it was the saber that was issued by the school, it would probably have been very difficult to break through the armored saber-toothed tiger's defense. Even using the shadowless saber would be somewhat strenuous. The shadowless saber was indeed good. However, it depended on whose hand the saber was in. If it was in Xue Bailong's hand, this single blade would have been enough to cut this young armored saber-toothed tiger into two halves. And clearly, Chu Yunfan did not have that kind of astonishing skill. Therefore, Chu Yunfan had not immediately unsheathed the shadowless saber. Instead, he used the scabbard to smash the scales of the armored saber-toothed tiger into pieces. Only then did he make his move. However, this was not something that ordinary people could do. Ordinary people would not have the strength to do such a thing. Ordinary people could only hold on when they encounter an armored saber-toothed tiger and wait for an opportunity to escape. They would not even be able to cut through the scales of the armored saber-toothed tiger, let alone deal with it. From this perspective, the armored saber-toothed tiger was indeed extremely difficult to deal with. It was one of the toughest monsters. If this monster had not met Chu Yunfan, the students might have been severely injured by the armored saber-toothed tiger right from the start. To Chu Yunfan, he was not satisfied. He did not think that the current him was strong enough. Otherwise, he would have been able to chop the armored saber-toothed tiger into two halves with one strike. However, in the eyes of Qin Wu and Jin Feng, who were watching from afar, this was a very shocking performance. Chun Yunfan was neither anxious nor impatient. Using his advantage, he was able to suppress the notoriously difficult armored saber-toothed tiger alone. After seeing Chu Yunfan injure the armored saber-toothed tiger, the two of them let out a sigh of relief. According to the situation, as long as Chu Yunfan was careful, he would at least have no problem protecting himself. Your student is quite good. I reckon he'll secure one of the spots in the top 20. Jin Feng said. Think so too. I just don't know how far he can go. Now that all the good students have been taken away by those focus middle schools, it's not easy for our number 13 high school to produce a good student. Qin Wu nodded. Right now, he also felt that he could not see through Chu Yunfan. When he had just noticed Chu Yunfan had not been this strong. It had only been 2 months, and he was actually able to suppress an armored saber-toothed tiger. This must be so-called talent. Perhaps Chu Yunfan had really opened his eyes. At the same time, the spot where Chu Yunfan had cut the armored saber-toothed tiger, fresh blood sprayed out. The armored saber-toothed tiger roared in pain. This further stimulated the ferocity in its heart and it continued to roar. Previously, only its scales had been shattered by Chu Yunfan. Now, its entire left forepaw had almost been cut off. It was very difficult for the armored saber-toothed tiger to exert force. However, it still pounced forward, wanting to bite Chu Yunfan to death. Chu Yunfan was neither fast nor slow. He slashed down again, landing his strike on the wound of the armored saber-toothed tiger without missing a beat. At this moment, Chu Yunfan had the support of more than 100 slashes. When he used the earth-splitting saber technique, each slash was terrifyingly powerful. As long as Chu Yunfan's stamina did not run out, he could continue to use it. Of course, the further he went, the more powerful the strikes would be. The amount of stamina the saber-toothed tiger had to expend would also increase. It couldn't continue. Its body could not hold on any longer. Roar! The armored saber-toothed tiger fell down. It continued to roar on the ground, rolling and struggling. This was because one of its front paws had been sliced off by Chu Yunfan. He actually did it. Amazing, amazing. If we were on the same level as him, I'm afraid that even we wouldn't be able to achieve this. Jin Feng said as his eyes opened wide. The armored saber-toothed tiger was indeed difficult to deal with. Qin Wu also nodded, feeling extremely shocked in his heart. The 2 homeroom teachers were shocked in their hearts, but Chu Yunfan was not satisfied. He was shocked in his heart. The armored saber-toothed tiger was indeed difficult to deal with. He had tried all means and methods, but only managed to cut off one of its front paws. If it was any other ferocious beast, it would not be so difficult to deal with. The armored saber-toothed tiger rolled on the ground for a while before it got back up again. It was able to stand up on 3 legs. It was indeed a monster with extraordinary talent. Its physical quality was far better than that of an ordinary person. After having one of its paws chopped off, the armored saber-toothed tiger became even more ferocious. At this time, it was actually the most dangerous. As the saying goes, what was even more dangerous than a monster was a cornered one. A monster's counterattack before death was actually more dangerous than all the previous stages. If one was not careful, even a veteran could be killed. Ewoosh! The armored saber-toothed tiger pounced forward. Its movements were a few times faster than before. Chu Yunfan's saber slashed toward the head of the armored saber-toothed tiger. His movements were absolutely precise. A fountain of fresh blood sprayed out. The armored saber-toothed tiger was sent flying by Chu Yunfan's strike. This strike, which was enough to split a person in half, only left a bloody scar on the forehead of the armored saber-toothed tiger. Although it had injured the armored saber-toothed tiger, it was not severely injured at all. Chu Yunfan felt that his arm was slightly numb. After going berserk, the armored saber-toothed tiger's strength had clearly increased by several folds. It actually made his arm slightly numb. No wonder the body of a monster was said to be much more terrifying than a human's. However, he did not know that in the eyes of others, he was more terrifying. To be able to single-handedly suppress an armored saber-toothed tiger, he was the real monster. Since this is the case, then I can only use other methods. Chu Yunfan took a step forward and directly threw out a blinding flash of light with a strike. It was so dazzling that people could not open their eyes. It landed on the armored saber-toothed tiger's forehead with lightning speed, directly onto the bloody scar. Bam! This strike knocked the armored saber-toothed tiger back. The crack on its forehead had obviously expanded a lot. There were even cracks on its bones. However, before the slash ended, Chu Yunfan's next slash came down again. It was as fast as lightning. The shadowless blade shimmered through the air. When it fell, it landed on the bloody scar on the armored saber-toothed tiger's forehead. At this moment, Chu Yunfan seemed to have entered an unprecedented state. He had already practiced the roaring wind saber technique till the impeccable stage. And now, he had taken another step forward. He had broken through from the impeccable stage to the perfection stage. As the light of the blade faded, the armored saber-toothed tiger's head exploded and spewed out blood. It struggled twice before finally falling over dead. Chapter 85. Transformation after 10 days of actual combat. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 85. Transformation after 10 days of actual combat. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. From the crack on its head, it could be seen that just now, Chu Yunfan's strike had slashed into the armored saber-toothed tiger's head, turning its brain into mush. Although the armored saber-toothed tiger was armed to the teeth, its brain was still one of the weakest points. It was no different compared to the brain of an ordinary human. With a single slash, it could be chopped into pieces. At this point, Chu Yunfan let out a sigh of relief. If it was chopped in other places, this armored saber-toothed tiger could have relied on its tenacious vitality to continue fighting. The only way was to chop on its brain so that it would be impossible for it to continue jumping around. Chu Yunfan's breathing became labored. His back felt cold. This was his first life-and-death battle, and he had faced such a famous ferocious beast. Although he had appeared very calm throughout the battle, he had been forcing himself to remain calm. He was not like those battle veterans who were already numb. Therefore, immediately after the battle ended, he felt a little exhausted. However, at this moment, his mind was still immersed in the breakthrough he had just made. In that attack just now, he had finally broken through to the perfection stage of the roaring wind saber technique. The perfection stage was a kind of comprehension, it was a feeling. Chu Yunfan had been stuck at the impeccable stage for a very long time. What he lacked was an opportunity. And now, this armored saber-toothed tiger had provided him with such an opportunity. After a long time, Chu Yunfan finally completely digested the comprehension. He was confident that his roaring wind saber technique was firmly in the perfection stage. His combat strength had clearly increased by a lot. Looking at the armored saber-toothed tiger on the ground, his eyes could not help but be a little pained. This was all money. He had checked on the internet. Even the corpse of a young armored saber-toothed tiger could easily be sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The scales on the armored saber-toothed tiger's body could be made into soft armor. It was not considered heavy, but its defensive level was very good. Moreover, its sharp fangs were also good materials for forging swords. The flesh of the armored saber-toothed tiger was a favorite of many rich people. The flesh of these monsters contained a large amount of spiritual energy. Long-term consumption could subtly improve one's physique. Therefore, monster meat had always been an important part of the richest dining table. The stronger the monster, the better the effect. The children of the rich families grew up eating the flesh of these monsters. When they became adults, even if their talents were similar, they would be much stronger than the children of ordinary families. This society seemed to be equal, but in fact, it had never been equal from the beginning. The starting point of the people at the top of the pyramid was the end point of countless people's lives. And the corpses of these monsters were the spoils of the army. Otherwise, why would the school let the army activate the electromagnetic curtain wall? The consumption of the wall was not small either. Chu Yunfan sighed for a moment before he tossed this thought out of his mind. He did not forget that this was still a battlefield that was fraught with danger. Moreover, he believed that he could rely on his own hands to change the fate of himself and his family. At this moment, he discovered that he did not know whether it was because of the bloody smell in the air, or because there was no crossfire between the fortresses, more and more monsters appeared in the distance. Chu Yunfan knew that the actual battle had only just begun. Thinking of this, he took a step forward and directly pounced toward another monster. Inside a fortress, Shui Bailong looked through the windows and saw the students and monsters fighting on the battlefield. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. They're just a bunch of rookies, but it's precisely because of the endless supply of such rookies that we humans have hope. Can we really survive this calamity? Immediately after, Shui Bailong instructed his subordinates, all of you be careful. Should those powerful monsters try to shoot them outside the battlefield. If a few more people are killed or injured, the people from the Ministry of Education will definitely cause a ruckus. Yes, sir. Time flew by very quickly on the battlefield. In fact, more than half a day had passed before the end of the intense battle. After the battle, they were completely exhausted. They retreated behind the electromagnetic curtain wall and went to look for tents to sleep in. When they woke up, they joined the battlefield again. There was almost no time to stop. And no one dared to stop. There was no need for anyone to whip them from behind. They all knew that this kind of opportunity for actual combat was rare. Since the school had persuaded the army to open this backdoor for them, they would have to pay the price. They could not possibly back down now. Therefore, they all made full use of this opportunity. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed. L.RG After 10 days, the essence, energy, and spirit of the hundreds of students in the two classes had completely changed. Being part of the army had transformed them. No matter how well trained they were, they could only be called well-trained. Only after experiencing a real bloody battle and surviving 100 battles could they be called elites. 10 days without a break, regardless of whether it was day or night, these students had already completed the initial transformation. 10 days ago, most of the students were still flustered when facing monsters, but after 10 days, they were already able to face the monsters calmly. Although some people were born with steadiness, calm and composed, unflustered and unhurried, most of the people's big hearts were trained. After experiencing a lot, this was nothing. It was not that no one got injured during these 10 days. Facing powerful monsters, it was very normal to be injured. The sharp claws of the monsters were not inferior to ordinary sharp weapons. Some students even had their entire arm cut off. If it were back in the common era, they would basically be crippled. However, this was not a big deal now. They entered the infirmary of the fortress to reattach the broken limbs. Within 2 days, they were back on the battlefield, alive and kicking. Under this kind of life-and-death training, the students' strength increased very quickly. 10 days ago, there were still quite a number of students who only had the cultivation of the Qi nourishment stage. Now, the last Qi nourishment stage student had also stepped into the Qi C stage 3 days ago, achieving the basic threshold for the focus class. Such a transformation was as if they had gone through some kind of baptism. Everyone's cultivation had improved. Those who improved faster had broken through a stage on the spot, while the others, even if they had not broken through on the spot, they were not far away from breaking through. It would not be long before they would break through after the actual combat session. It could be said that they had gained a great deal. 10 days later, these students were more or less injured. They were not as spotless as they were when they first arrived. However, it was not the same for everyone. There was one person who had not suffered a single injury from the beginning to the end. That person was the focus of everyone's attention, Chu Yunfan. Chapter 86. A battle record of no injuries. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 86. A battle record of no injuries. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless fantasy translation. In these 10 days, there were a few people who stood out from the rest. Their performance had surpassed the others. Among them were the class monitors of two classes, Zhang Tang and Yang. As the most influential people in the school, the two of them were outstanding. Their cultivations were obviously much stronger than the others. Besides them, there were two other people whose performance was also very eye-catching. One of them was the first beauty of Class 2, Tang Xiu. The performance of the goddess in the hearts of many boys in Class 2, and even Class 1, was outstanding. Within 10 days, she had killed more than 15 monsters and had gained only a few injuries. The other person who stood above the rest was Chu Yunfan. This was because he had not been injured once, and he had successively killed more than 20 monsters, 5 more than Tang Xiu. If they had not seen it with their own eyes, they would not have believed it. Such killing efficiency was almost on par with Zhang Tang and Yang. However, Zhang Tang and Yang were obviously stronger than Chu Yunfan. This was what everyone was most amazed about. Besides them, the strongest among them had only killed 8 monsters. Not a single person had killed more than 10. Elites like Gao Hongji and Feng Dang had only killed 6 monsters each in the past 10 days, while most had only killed 2 or 3. This was because not every monster they found would be killed by them. Many of them only injured the monsters and were unable to chase after them after the monsters ran away. Or perhaps they were injured and could not kill the monsters in the end. The reason why Chu Yunfan was able to attract everyone's attention was not only because of the number of monsters he had killed, which was comparable to the kill number of the class monitors. Most importantly, none of the monsters that he faced had managed to escape him. Chu Yunfan's battle had been very well paced. He would not return to the tent behind the electromagnetic curtain wall after each battle to rest like an ordinary person. Instead, he would meditate in front of the electromagnetic curtain wall, using this as a substitute for rest. When he got up, he would once again join the battle. This went on for several days and nights. It was as if there was not a single moment that could stop him. He would only retreat behind the electromagnetic curtain wall to eat and drink. This was something that an ordinary student would dare to do. It was simply too dangerous, especially during the night. Some cunning monsters would even lurk near the electromagnetic curtain wall waiting to strike. A few students thought that there would be no dangers near the electromagnetic curtain wall and ended up being ambushed by monsters and almost lost their lives. The person who saved them was Chu Yunfan. Chu Yunfan had also been ambushed. But even when he was meditating, he would spring to his feet immediately. Many people felt that he had the instincts of a monster. Therefore, he did not go looking for monsters many times, but without exception, he did not miss even a single one. One had to know that even Yang, Zhang Tang, and Tang Xiu had missed more than once and had let several monsters escape, not to mention that they were injured by the monsters. Zhang Tang was slashed by a monster in the chest. It had left behind a huge bloody gash. On the other hand, Chu Yunfan's battles were different. His battles were continuous, and in each strike, the earth-splitting saber technique would be fully unleashed. After a barrage of strikes, the monsters would not be able to fight back and their power would falter, which was why Chu Yunfan did not get injured at all. In the words of the two teachers, Chu Yunfan's battles looked violent and disorderly, but they were actually controlled. After meeting Chu Yunfan, those monsters would be completely under his control. As time passed, this pattern became more and more obvious. Just like when Chu Yunfan had killed the armored saber-toothed tiger the first time. The speed and strength of that monster were actually above Chu Yunfan's, but in the end, he had killed it without suffering a single wound. His method of fighting required high physical stamina. It looked simple, but in fact, no one could replicate it. And Chu Yunfan went on in this way. Search for a monster, kill it, then meditate to recover his strength. Then, he would go out to search for the next monster, kill that one, and then meditate again. This process was repeated over and over again. Before he knew it, more than 20 monsters had died by his hands. During these 10 days, he had gained a lot. This kind of near-death combat experience was not something he could obtain in school. Even though his previous fight with Lu Yushu could be considered intense, it did not count because he knew that Lu Yushu would not kill him, and he would not kill Lu Yushu either. Under this mentality, he had held back his strength during that so-called all-out battle. Only here did he use all of his strength to kill the monsters. This was because he knew that if he did not use all of his strength, the monsters would bite off his head. Although his strength had not reached the level of Zhang Tang and Ouyang, after his roaring wind saber technique and the earth-splitting saber technique had both reached the perfection stage, he could seamlessly switch between the two saber techniques. Each strike had looked the same, but in reality, the strikes that he slashed out were completely different. Some were extremely fast, while others were powerful and heavy. The power of each strike was endless and each was different. Every monster had its own rhythm, and it could even change its rhythm according to the opponent it was facing. However, facing Chu Yunfan's battle method, which was sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes light, and sometimes heavy, the monsters were all completely caught off guard. This was also Chu Yunfan's battle method that had been tried and tested repeatedly. With this kind of battle method, he had killed over 20 monsters within 10 days without sustaining any injuries. After just 10 days of actual combat, Chu Yunfan felt that he had undergone a transformation. People who had seen blood were completely different from those who had never seen blood. It was as if he, a flower that had been raised in a greenhouse, had been placed under violent winds for 10 days. If he did not die, he would transform. Chu Yunfan woke up from his meditation once again. He let out a long breath. This time, he had not broken through to the third level of the Qi-Si stage. However, he was in no hurry. He could already feel it. That last barrier was like a layer of paper. It was only a matter of time before it was broken. There's only one more day left. Let's see if I can break through. Chu Yunfan gripped his shadowless saber tightly. 10 days of actual combat had passed in a flash. He had gained a lot, but he still wanted to try and see if he could make another breakthrough at the last moment. Chu Yunfan suddenly stomped his foot. His body was like a floating feather. He instantly flew over 10 meters and entered the battlefield. During this period of time, not only had his saber technique improved, but his actual combat experience had also improved. His movements were also much better than before. Previously, he could not have covered this distance. He had not been able to exert this much force as easily as he currently could. Last day, here I come. Chapter 87. Crisis. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 87. Crisis. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Early in the morning, everyone stepped onto the battlefield in high spirits. Today was the last day. And just like Chu Yunfan, everyone was trying to make one last push today. After today, there would be no more such good opportunities. By the time Chu Yunfan stepped onto the battlefield, he could already see many students engaged in battling monsters. It was different from 10 days ago. 10 days ago, the students were all flustered. But now, they were calm and collected. And in the depths of the battlefield, Tang Xiyu, Ouyang, Zhang Tang, and the other outstanding students of both classes had already entered the battlefield. Previously, the students' battle line was pushed back to the vicinity of the electromagnetic curtain wall by the monsters. They even had to rely on the protection of the electromagnetic curtain wall to be able to stop the monsters. However, after 10 days, the students who were not considered weak in the first place had pushed back the battle line. Now, the powerful students could even go deeper into the battlefield. As a result, they encountered more and more monsters. Even Tang Xiyu and the others also suffered injuries. Chu Yunfan had just entered deep into the battlefield when he encountered a creature that looked like a mouse that was reaching out for his abdomen. Violet Lightning Sable. Chu Yunfan immediately recognized the origin of this creature. It was a monster that was born from the mutation of a sable after it was stimulated by spirit energy. The violet lightning sable was a species of monster that was extremely fast. It had purple fur on its back and it moved like lightning, hence its name, the violet lightning sable. Compared to the armored saber-toothed tiger, the violet lightning sable was not even 1/3 the size of the armored saber-toothed tiger. However, in terms of the degree of trouble, it was not the least bit inferior because it was really speedy. Ordinary students, even ordinary teachers, would find it very troublesome to deal with this monster. This violet lightning sable's eyes carried a fierce and vicious aura. Although it looked a little cute, Chu Yunfan knew that these monsters were not pets. If he treated them with the attitude of a saint, then he would certainly die in vain. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The violet lightning sable squealed in a low voice. In an instant, its body charged forward, darting from left to right. It charged forward in a Z-shaped line and approached rapidly. As it was not moving in a straight line, those who were slow to react would not be able to react at all, and their necks would be bitten off in one bite. However, Chu Yunfan was no ordinary person. His eyes were firmly fixed on the violet lightning sable. His dynamic vision was extremely good, and he instantly found the correct location. Then, he drew his saber. With a clang, there was a flash of light. Chu Yunfan's saber directly and accurately struck the violet lightning sable. Chu Yunfan's strike was fast and powerful. Even the armored saber-toothed tiger was forced back by his saber light, let alone the violet lightning sable. It was struck by Chu Yunfan's saber and was sent flying, landing on the ground with a heavy thud. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The violet lightning sable rolled on the ground, screaming in pain. Unlike the armored saber-toothed tiger, it was not covered in scales and could be hurt by blades and swords. Its fur did have a certain degree of defense though, so if a normal blade or sword did not hit it directly, it would be very difficult to cause huge damage. However, it was struck head-on by Chu Yunfan's saber. Coupled with the extremely sharp edge of the shadowless saber, it caused a huge bloody scar to open up on the violet lightning sable's body. Blood and flesh flew everywhere, and one could even vaguely see its bones. This violet lightning sable had been through hundreds of battles to survive until now. It was very sensitive to danger. In almost an instant, it understood that the two legs in front of it were not easy to deal with. It immediately turned around and fled into the distance. Trying to run away. How could I let you escape? Fortunately, Chu Yunfan was already prepared. When the violet lightning sable turned tail to run, Chu Yunfan immediately appeared beside the violet lightning sable. Slash! The light of the saber once again poured out. In an instant, the light that filled the sky had already surrounded the violet lightning sable. Then, the light that filled the sky finally turned into a shocking strike that slashed at the violet lightning sable. Slash slash. The violet lightning sable was slashed and heavily fell to the ground. After struggling for a moment, it stopped moving. Chu Yunfan had almost split its body into two. This kind of monster that won with speed was most afraid of people like Chu Yunfan who had the advantage in both speed and strength. Once its speed was not an advantage, its actual combat strength was revealed, and it was not even 1/10 of the armored saber-toothed tiger. Another one. Chu Yunfan had on a slight smile. A monster like the violet lightning sable was his favorite. It was easy to kill. Of course, this was only relative to him. If it was someone else, it would have been very troublesome. However, at this moment, after killing the violet lightning sable, Chu Yunfan immediately felt that the atmosphere around him was not quite right. The air faintly emitted a kind of hostility. This kind of feeling could not be seen or touched, but he still felt it nevertheless. Ever since the godhead had entered his body, Chu Yunfan had become very sensitive to these auras. Otherwise, while he was meditating previously, he would not have been able to spring up the moment those monsters attacked. He looked over and quickly realized that something was not right. The students had already gone deep into the battlefield to chase after the monsters. At this moment, there were quite a number of monsters quietly surrounding him from nearby. This isn't good. Chu Yunfan immediately realized that something was wrong. Those monsters were intentionally surrounding and hunting. Even wild beasts had a certain level of intelligence, especially those that hunted collectively. For example, wolf packs, lion packs, and many others, all had the intelligence to hunt as a pack. After absorbing spiritual energy and transforming into monsters, their intelligence would only increase. It would be a huge mistake to treat them as unintelligent wild beasts. It was obvious that these monsters were intentionally surrounding and killing them as if they were prey. However, what unnerved Chu Yunfan even more was that these monsters belonged to different races. Under normal circumstances, they would not cooperate. So what prompted them to cooperate now? Thinking of this, Chu Yunfan hurriedly turned on the intercom device on his wristband and directly connected to Qin Wu. "Coach, something bad has happened. Those monsters are intentionally surrounding us and are trying to catch us all in one go. Come and support us." As Chu Yunfan spoke, his entire body flew out like a cannonball. Then, he heavily hit the ground and used the rebound force to fly away again. At this time, he no longer cared about the control of power. Qin Wu and Jin Feng, who had received the news, also hurriedly looked toward the battlefield. As expected, there were already many monsters approaching the edge of the battlefield. "Till go and save them. Inform the garrison and come back later," Qin Wu said to Jin Feng. After saying that, he shot out like an arrow from a bow. The tense situation was on the verge of breaking out. Chapter 88. I'm going to save someone. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 88. I'm going to save someone. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chu Yunfan quickly rushed into the depths of the battlefield, and the entire situation began to turn out as he had expected. As expected, those monsters planned to overwhelm them all in one go. At this time, all the students had already received Qin Wu's notice and began to retreat. However, there were still quite a few students who did not have the time to retreat. They were all too deep into the battlefield. At this moment, it was too late even if they wanted to escape. After discovering that the students were showing signs of retreating, the monsters all increased their speed and pounced on them. There were a few students who were entangled with the monsters. Among them was Gao Hongji. Chu Yunfan had also called to inform him at the first moment. While Gao Hongji was retreating, he was attacked by a few monsters. The long spear in his hand was heavy and powerful. It was so powerful that the monsters did not dare to approach it. It was very impressive. However, it could only deal with one monster at a time. At this moment, there were suddenly a few more monsters attacking him. He was suddenly in a tight spot. At this rate, it was only a matter of time before he was injured. Fortunately, he was using a long-range weapon. At this moment, the advantage of a long weapon was displayed. 1 inch long and 1 inch strong. He brandished his spear like a tiger. Before his stamina was exhausted, the monsters would find it difficult to get close to him. However, Chu Yunfan could also see that Gao Hongji, who had been through battle, had used up more than half of his stamina. He would not be able to hold out for long. Chu Yunfan immediately became anxious. Over the last 2 years, they had become extremely good friends. Chu Yunfan clearly knew that Gao Hongji was in danger and was not willing to stand by and do nothing. Chu Yunfan's figure continuously flashed across the ground. His speed was extremely fast as he flew rapidly toward Gao Hongji, who was deep within the battlefield. At this moment, a few monsters had already surrounded Gao Hongji and were attacking him. One of them ran so fast that it blocked his way out. If it was any other time, Chu Yunfan might have been happy to have a big fight with this monster. However, at this moment, he was so anxious that he was not in the mood to have a big fight with this monster. Get out of my way! Chu Yunfan shouted and immediately drew his saber. A blinding flash of light slashed down and directly hit that monster. Bam! That monster was sent flying. In his haste, Chu Yunfan had not held back at all. He slashed out a huge wound onto the body of that monster, almost cutting off its head. The monster that was sent flying crashed heavily onto the ground. It kept struggling and rolling, continuously roaring. It could only watch as Chu Yunfan flew away. It did not dare to move forward. It could sense an extremely dangerous feeling from Chu Yunfan's person. The monster understood that if it dared to approach, it would probably die. All of this might seem to have happened over a long stretch of time, but it was actually just a short moment. Chu Yunfan rushed toward Gao Hongji's direction without stopping. Very soon, he had already reached the vicinity of where Gao Hongji was making his stand. At this moment, Gao Hongji, who was holding a long spear, was already in danger. Facing several monsters at once had depleted his physical strength greatly. The frequency of his strikes was much lower than before. Holes had started to appear within the defensive net that was created by the long spear. Several times, he was almost killed by the monsters. At this moment, Chu Yunfan arrived. He had just arrived but did not even have the slightest rest as he immediately started attacking with his saber. Relying on the terrifying aura that came from charging all the way, his extremely fast speed, coupled with Chu Yunfan's merciless attack, this saber directly slashed onto the body of a monster. Roar! This monster was sent flying, and then heavily fell to the ground. It only roared for a while before it stopped breathing because its entire body had been cut in half by Chu Yunfan. The power of Chu Yunfan's blade that contained anger and accumulated momentum was beyond imagination. Otherwise, Chu Yunfan's strike would have only been able to injure it, and it would not be able to directly cut it into two pieces. Huff, huff, huff. This strike was extremely powerful, but at the same time, it also consumed a lot of Chu Yunfan's physical strength. In addition to the physical strength that he had consumed on the way, it actually made him feel that he could no longer support himself. Great, you're here. When Gao Hongji saw that it was Chu Yunfan, he was immediately overjoyed. He had already used up too much of his physical strength. Just when he was about to be unable to hold on any longer, Chu Yunfan appeared. Right now, there were still two monsters in front of them. However, these two monsters were directly in front of them. After roaring twice, they looked at Chu Yunfan in fear and fled. They could feel the terrifying hostility from Chu Yunfan's body. Gao Hongji was also dumbfounded. After a long while, he said, I didn't expect these beasts to bully the weak and fear the strong. They saw that I was easy to bully, so they all came to bully me. When they saw that you were not easy to bully, they actually ran away. All right, don't be sour. Hurry up and leave. There's something wrong with these monsters. Chu Yunfan knocked Gao Hongji with the back of his saber and said. What about you? What are you going to do? Don't tell me you want to stay. Gao Hongji looked at Chu Yunfan suspiciously and said. I'm going to save that one over there. Chu Yunfan said as he clenched his teeth. He looked over and saw that in the distance, on the other side of the battlefield, a terrifying monster had actually appeared. Armored saber-toothed tiger. When Gao Hongji saw that terrifying figure, his expression changed and his face fell. That monster's aura was extremely terrifying. From afar, he could feel terrifying demonic energy soaring through the sky. That armored saber-toothed tiger was different from the one Chu Yunfan had killed on the first day. That one had only been in its infancy stage, while this one was a true adult armored saber-toothed tiger. Its terrifying body was more than 5 meters tall, almost as tall as 3 people. Chu Yunfan instantly understood that the abnormal actions of these monsters were probably driven by this adult armored saber-toothed tiger. At this moment, on the battlefield, most of the students had already retreated to the other side of the electromagnetic curtain wall. A small number of people were entangled by the monsters, but they had also been dealt with by the other students, or they had been dealt with by Qin Wu and Jin Feng, the two homeroom teachers. Even Ouyang and Zhang Teng, who had entered the deepest part of the battlefield, had already retreated to a position similar to Chu Yunfan and the others. Only a figure was alone in the depths of the battlefield, surrounded by several monsters. He watched as the armored saber-toothed tiger began to run, approaching the figure at lightning speed. Its speed was getting faster and faster, to the point that it made people feel fear and despair. "You're not going to save Tang Xiu, are you? Are you crazy? That's an adult armored saber-toothed tiger," Gao Hongji said. "At this time, I don't have much of a choice. If I don't go, she'll die for sure," Chu Yunfan said. After saying that, Chu Yunfan's body flew out like a cannonball, approaching Tang Xiu's direction. "This B** is acting cool again. Will it kill you to not play the hero?" Gao Hongji mumbled, but his eyes were determined. Then, he raised his spear and chased after Chu Yunfan. "What's going on? Why are they still pushing forward?" At this moment, all the students in the class noticed Chu Yunfan and Gao Hongji who were charging upstream, as well as the lone Tang Xiu. Chapter 89. The Terrifying Adult Armored Saber-Toothed Tiger. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 89. The Terrifying Adult Armored Saber-Toothed Tiger. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. What are the two of them trying to do? Qin Wu, who had rushed over from behind, immediately asked in surprise. Then, he hurriedly opened the communication channel. "Chu Yunfan, Gao Hongji, what are the two of you doing? Hurry up and come back. It's too dangerous. Teacher, we're going to save Tang Xiu. It's rare for me to act so heroically. Don't interrupt me." Gao Hongji raised his spear and shouted. "Bu starred. Now you two are acting cool. Don't you know how dangerous it is? I'll go and save Tang Xiu. Come back here." Qin Wu shouted as he flew. "No, you're too far back, sir. By the time you arrive, it'll be too late." Chu Yunfan's voice came from the communication channel. Hearing this, the students finally understood why the two of them had turned back. Previously, everyone had only heard Qin Wu say that it was dangerous, and they were all frantically running back to the electromagnetic curtain wall. They could not care less about the situation of the others. At most, they could only help the students nearby. They all looked toward the depths of the battlefield. Indeed, in the depths of the battlefield, there was the figure of a young girl facing several monsters. Many people's hearts tightened. As the school belle of number 13 high school, Tang Xiu's popularity was very high. Many people wanted to help, but there was nothing they could do. They were too far away, so they could only watch and place their hopes on Chu Yunfan and the others. That powerful armored saber-toothed tiger rushed over, its fierce aura enveloping the entire battlefield. Roar! The armored saber-toothed tiger roared, shaking the entire battlefield. Tang Xiu had also noticed the armored saber-toothed tiger that was charging over. She wanted to retreat, but she did not have a choice. She was held back by a few monsters. She had to be careful of those monsters injuring her. Any one of these monsters was enough to pose a threat to her. She became more and more anxious. For a split second, she was not careful, and one of the monsters drew a huge bloody scar on her snow-white arm. Fresh blood dripped down from the wound, and she could no longer hold the sword in her hand. It fell down with a clank. At this moment, a monster saw an opportunity and pounced at her. It opened its bloody mouth to snap at Tang Xiu. Tang Xiu saw no way out and gave up. Was she going to die here? Suddenly, at this moment, a flash of blinding light descended from the sky. Have you ever seen a strike descend from the sky? That strike directly came down onto the body of this monster. Slash. This monster was sent flying and crashed heavily onto the ground. It struggled a few times but in the end, it stopped breathing. This strike had shattered its skull and crushed its head. The strongest part of a monster's body was its skull. However, once the skull was broken, the skull would become the weakest part. Being distracted in battle is not a good habit. A light laugh came from behind Tang Xiu. Soon after, a figure appeared beside her. When she looked, her delicate figure immediately trembled. That person was none other than Chu Yunfan. Just as he arrived, he slashed down with his saber with all his might. Chu Yunfan's breathing was a little labored. Following that, there was the sound of hurried footsteps, followed by the sound of a spear piercing through the air. A spear appeared horizontally in the air, blocking a monster that was pouncing over, directly sweeping the monster away. Tsai, you were a little slow. Gao Hongji had finally caught up. Tang Xiu looked at her two classmates, and could not help but reveal a slightly moved expression. She knew that the situation she was facing was terrible. At this time, the others were all trying to protect themselves, but these two had risked their lives to rush over and help her. These few years, she had deliberately kept a distance from her classmates because she knew that they would not have any interactions in the future. It would only increase her sadness. But now, she was wavering. Thank you. Tang Xiu blinked her big eyes, bit her lower lip slightly, and said. No need to thank me. Quickly use some healing spray to stop the bleeding. Chu Yunfan hurriedly reminded her. Hearing this, Tang Xiu hurriedly took out the healing spray that she always carried with her. After she sprayed it on, the bleeding on her arm stopped almost immediately. Old Gao, you block the other monsters. I'll block that big fellow. Chu Yunfan took a deep breath and said. In front of him, the armored saber-toothed tiger was already less than 10 meters away. This distance was only a short distance to the armored saber-toothed tiger. A fierce aura assaulted Chu Yunfan's face. Compared to this adult armored saber-toothed tiger, the monsters that he had killed in the past 10 days were nothing. In the past 10 days, those powerful monsters would usually be shot and killed outside the battlefield. Although those monsters had been troublesome, they were not considered fatal. But this adult armored saber-toothed tiger was a monster that had surpassed the acquired stage of the Qi nourishment stage. In front of this monster, an ordinary person would be so scared that their entire body would go limp and they would not even have any thought of resisting. Okay, I can handle that. Don't do anything rash. Gao Hongji said. At this moment, Chu Yunfan smiled and said, do you still remember what Lieutenant Xue said? If you encounter a powerful monster, you have to face it bravely and then stare at it. This way, you die with more dignity. I didn't expect to actually encounter this scenario. However, I don't intend to die, even if it's an armored saber-toothed tiger. Chu Yunfan held onto his saber with both hands. This was the first time. Previously, even when he was facing that young armored saber-toothed tiger, he could still suppress it with just one hand. The armored saber-toothed tiger arrived in the blink of an eye. The pressure from this mountain-like monster bared down on them. Roar! The armored saber-toothed tiger pounced in front of the three of them. It raised its head and let out a long roar. Then, it raised its front paws and clawed at Chu Yunfan. Slash! 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 The armored saber-toothed tiger's body was huge, but it was as fast as lightning. An ordinary person would not have been able to keep up with such speed. However, Chu Yunfan's eyes were fixed on it. Then, in that instant, his saber swept across the sky and struck the armored saber-toothed tiger's front paws. Clang! A clear sound, like the clashing of metal, rang out. Chu Yunfan's saber had struck the front claws of the armored saber-toothed tiger. A few sparks flew out. Chu Yunfan only left a scratch on the front claws of the armored saber-toothed tiger. However, he was unable to break through its highly defensive scales. Thud, thud, thud. Chun Yunfan took a few steps before he finally stabilized himself. His hands began to tremble. What great strength! An adult and an infant armored saber-toothed tiger were like two different creatures. He could suppress an infant armored saber-toothed tiger with one hand, but against this adult armored saber-toothed tiger, his arm was numbed from the shock. The armored saber-toothed tiger was more terrifying than he had imagined, but he had no other choice. He had already reached this point. He had to charge forward bravely and stall for time so that Qin Wu could rush over to rescue him. Chapter 90. Breakthrough in a Fierce Battle, Third Level of the Qi Si Stage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 90. Breakthrough in a Fierce Battle, Third Level of the Qi Si Stage. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. This armored saber-toothed tiger looked at the tiny two-legged animal in front of it and felt a little strange. Its body was small, but it had not expected that its strength was not small. However, its eyes were quickly replaced by an even fiercer look, and it pounced at Chu Yunfan. The adult armored saber-toothed tiger was the size of a small mountain. When it pounced out, it was as if a small mountain had pounced over. A bloody smell assaulted his senses. Chu Yunfan naturally did not dare to take it head-on. He quickly dodged and moved to the side. Even so, he was still almost pounced on. This armored saber-toothed tiger was huge. Even though it had only moved slightly, Chu Yunfan would have to jump great distances to avoid it. Chu Yunfan felt a gust of evil wind sweep past his face. It tuned into a strong fierce wind, blowing so hard that his face hurt. Although he had jumped early, he was still almost swept by the sharp claws. Chu Yunfan could only draw his saber and hack at the armored saber-toothed tiger's body. With the help of the reaction force from the strike, he somersaulted in the air and landed on the ground. "Old Gao, take Tang Xiu and go," Chu Yunfan said. He could clearly feel the terror of this adult armored saber-toothed tiger. He could only let them retreat first. "No, you're using a saber. With my spear, I'm more suited to go against this guy. Stop fooling around." Gao Hongji was the first to object. "Don't look down on me. Although I'm injured, I'm not a piece of trash." Tang Xiu brandished her sword. She had switched her sword to a different hand, but it did not affect her agility at all. If it were not for this matter, no one would have known that Tang Xiu was good with a sword in both hands. "Okay, we'll hold on until Coach Qin Wu gets here. But you guys have to be careful. This beast is strong," Chu Yunfan said. Just now, he had clashed with the sharp claws of the monster with his saber and his arm was already trembling, the shadowless saber that was sold for 3 million apiece. This kind of divine weapon was not just sharp. At the same time, it also had a very good shock absorption. Even after the shock absorption, Chu Yunfan was still unable to bear it. Tang Xiu and Gao Hongji's expressions became solemn. They knew very well how great Chu Yunfan's strength was. But even so, Chu Yunfan was unable to bear it. How could they dare be careless? Moreover, from the monster's huge size, the two of them understood. However, before the three of them could finish speaking, the armored saber-toothed tiger pounced over. Even if it was a 1.3 fight, it was still extremely terrifying. A paw swept down, stirring up a monstrous wind. If one was careless and got hit, even if they did not die, they would still be heavily injured. Clang! With a loud collision sound, Gao Hongji cried out loudly. He almost lost his grip on his spear. After a head-on clash with the armored saber-toothed tiger, he immediately understood what Chu Yunfan meant by it being strong. There was even a faint trace of blood seeping out. His palm had been split open from the impact. F***ck, this beast is strong. Gao Hongji retreated and adjusted himself. However, the armored saber-toothed tiger did not have the time to seize the opportunity to continue attacking. This was because, at this time, Chu Yunfan and Tang Xiyu both attacked at the same time. Tang Xiyu's swordsmanship was light and agile. When facing such a super big guy, she was at a disadvantage, especially when the entire body of the armored saber-toothed tiger was covered in scales. Her sword could not pierce through it at all. Therefore, she could only take the agile route and jump up and down continuously. Her aim was to attack the armored saber-toothed tiger's eyes. Although she could not face the adult armored saber-toothed tiger head-on, she could still pin it down. An Ina head-on confrontation, it was up to Chu Yunfan. Although he was also being chased up and down by the armored saber-toothed tiger, he was obviously better than the other two. At least he could pose some threat to the armored saber-toothed tiger. Don't let it get you. Behind the three of them, Qin Wu was rapidly approaching. Facing this terrifying armored saber-toothed tiger, he did not have much confidence. However, Jin Feng had already notified the garrison. As long as he could hold out for a while, the army would be able to mobilize. This armored saber-toothed tiger would definitely die. However, the prerequisite was that Chu Yunfan and the other two could hold out. Although there was such a thing as a death count, it would still be a huge problem if 3 people died in one go. At this moment, Chu Yunfan, who was fighting against the armored saber-toothed tiger, was forced into a corner. This beast is so cunning. Chu Yunfan actually fell into a disadvantageous position and was forced to separate from the other two. Clearly, the armored saber-toothed tiger intended to kill him first before dealing with the other 2 people. Even if the attacks of the other 2 people landed directly on its body, it would still be difficult to cause fatal damage. To Chu Yunfan, this was a dead end. Its huge sharp claws swept across the sky and swept toward Chu Yunfan's head like a sharp blade. Once he was hit, his entire head would be cut off. Damn it, I'm going all out. At this moment, Chu Yunfan suddenly stopped panicking. His entire mind entered a state of clarity. At that critical moment, Chu Yunfan, who should have been absolutely unable to dodge, suddenly pulled out the saber in his hand and slashed out. Clang! With a loud boom, Chu Yunfan naturally could not contend with the armored saber-toothed tiger. However, borrowing the force of the rebound, Chu Yunfan flew out and dodged this fatal strike. Chu Yunfan's figure was like a feather in midair. He somersaulted and stood firm. Chu Yunfan, who had just stabilized himself, did not back down. Instead, he charged forward once more. If anyone could see Chu Yunfan's eyes at this moment, they would see that Chu Yunfan's gaze had completely changed. They did not look like the eyes of a human. There was not a hint of emotion in them. He was like a robot in a state of absolute calm. He unsheathed his saber, and a blinding light spilled out like mercury, slashing toward the armored saber-toothed tiger. The armored saber-toothed tiger was furious. This little bug actually dared to counterattack. It immediately made Chu Yunfan its primary target. Clang! 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 The sound of metal clashing rang out one after another, and Chu Yunfan's saber kept slashing down. At this time, he seemed to have entered a special state. The godhead in Chu Yunfan's body was surging up, and he felt unrestrained. The barrier of the 3rd level of the Qi-Si stage, which had been stuck for a long time, finally loosened. Every time his body swayed, he was able to avoid attacks that were originally impossible to avoid. Looking from afar, it could be said that danger was coming at him from all directions. Chu Yunfan himself did not feel that way. He only felt extremely carefree. After slashing down more than 100 times in a row, the thin layer of barrier finally broke. He had broken through to the third level of the Chi-C stage.